Are you ready to go offside? Because it's time for Offside Hockey Talk with your host, James Roberts, and myself, Doug Ireland.
Ladies and gentlemen, it makes me very happy to be sitting down right now with the great and powerful Mark Seidel. Mark, how are you doing tonight?
Good, guys. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too
Fine,
bad.
Danny.
Doug, how you hanging?
I'm hanging loose and free, my friend.
Well, we all know the draft is fast approaching, and I thought, who better to sit down with than yourself, Mark, to talk about the Canadian teams, what they'll be looking for, what they're going to do either to move up in the draft, acquire a first-round pick, or what they'll be looking for from an organizational standpoint. And you know what? I thought I'd tap you on the shoulder, sit down for about 30 minutes, and go through the Canadian-based teams. And if you're good for that, we'll jump right into her.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's get after it, and we'll see if we can figure something out for at least the 7 Canadian teams, anyways, if nobody else.
Well, let us start with Montreal. The Montreal Canadiens, they come into this draft kind of loaded with picks. They have 10 picks in the 2019 draft, 3 in the first 2 rounds. For myself, looking at Montreal from an organizational standpoint, they look like a team that, kind of needs to shed the Smurf persona and get a little bit bigger forward-wise, but also they seem to be lacking that next big defenseman or big D to step up into their lineup. So drafting at 15, many people would be hoping or maybe even wanting them to pick a player like a big Raphael Lavoie. Obviously French connection, the entire 9 yards there. But what do you think, Mark, that Montreal would need to do with the picks that they have, and what should they be going after for their team?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I think you're on to something. I think the back end needs some help. They've got some good prospects coming up up front, and I think they're okay in net. But I think on the back end is where they need to go. Unfortunately, in this draft, it's not a great defense group. You get Bo Byram at the top, and then you get some other guys. But they're going to be picking in around 15. If a guy like Cam York ever fell, he doesn't fit what you're talking about in terms of a big, strong defenseman, but he's certainly the new age defenseman in terms of skill and able to move the puck pretty well. Another guy that I looked at was Lassie Thompson, another guy that I could see had a good year in the Western Hockey League this year. So, there are a couple guys that jump to mind, but it'll depend on if they decide to move up or not. There's a couple defensemen up there that I'm a big fan of, Mark Seidel and Phil Broberg. So, Broberg makes sense. He's big. He can skate. But I don't think they're going to get him down at 15. So unless they decide to move up, I think they're going to have to settle for one of those defensemen. Or again, it'll be the theme of the evening here. But they're going to go with the best player available. You always go with best player available if he fills a need that you have. But at that spot in time, they may want to go D just to kind of solidify that part.
What do you think, Doug? What do you think Montreal would do in this situation? Do you see them drafting a defenseman like me and Mark have said, or do you see something else that they may be chasing down?
I mean, I think Montreal has been underperforming, so I almost feel like if you're going after a forward as the Montreal Canadiens GM, you're making a mistake because you have guys that will be doing better next season, almost assuredly, and you have one of the best goaltenders in hockey. I feel like defense is their big gap. Although I think like Mark said, that's going to be something we say over and over again. Defense is just something that every team needs more of. And what I want to know from Mark is how much defensive depth do you see in the draft? Do you see the Canadians You said you're expecting them you're expecting them to go and get a D, but do you think the depth is there for that to be sustained around the league? Because there's probably a dozen teams that are all going to be going for defensemen.
Yeah, I think the problem is, or not the problem, but I guess the issue is that in that top 10 or top 12, there's going to be a lot of centermen taken. Obviously Bo Byram is going to be taken. So, I think some of those defensemen are going to fall sort of in that 11 to 20 range, whether it be, the Mark Seidels, the Phil Brobergs, the Sundstrom kid. There's a bunch of kids that may very fault. I see Soderstrom, sorry. So those guys will fall into that range, and of course Montreal's right in the middle of that mix. So Soderstrom's another guy that moves real well. Not the biggest kid in the world, but I think the new age NHL kind of fits there too. So I think they'll have their choice at 15 if they want to go deep. And I don't think too many of those guys will go before them just because I think there's such depth up front with centermen and some wingers that are really good players. So, they'll have their pick. If they want to go D, they'll get to take the best one they have at that point. Thomas Harley's another guy from the Mississauga Steelheads. He does fit the big, strong 6'3" mold that, some teams are starting to look forward to. Look at what's going on in the Stanley Cup Finals here and have some offensive upside. So there'll be some guys they can pull from, but it just depends if that's the guy they want to go. If they want to fill a position, then they'll have 3 or 4 guys they can pull from.
Now, if they're going strictly, next best player available at their position, do you see them, if he was available, looking at Raphael Lavoie?
I don't have Raphael Lavoie as high as that. I'm not as high on him as some people are, certainly some teams are. I think he's a good player. I think he's got the problem Montreal is picking at 15. They're going to want to get a guy that can be a reasonably impactful guy down the road, and I'm not sure he's that. I think he's a piece of a team. I think he's a big, strong kid that kind of, does what some teams are really looking for in terms of grinding it down now a little bit more. But I just don't see him at that high now. The French-Canadian connection obviously is there, and he might be a guy that they covet. But for me, that would be a little rich. I think if they want to go get him, I think they could trade down a couple spots, probably 7 or 8 spots and still get him. I just don't see it. I think they're going to try to get a guy there that can kind of help them and be a key part of them going forward.
Well, that wraps up Montreal in a nutshell. Being a Leafs fan, you obviously don't want to see them do too well, but I am always of the boat. I'd like to see Canadian teams not only draft well, but end up doing well, because it bodes well for us when we play them, because it makes it more exciting. But we will see what they do come draft time. The next team on my list is the Ottawa Senators, and we all know what happened. I guess you could say dark cloud is about to drift off the Ottawa Senators with that first-round pick they traded away in the Matt Duchene deal to Colorado. Luckily, it didn't end up a lottery pick at 1 or 2. It did end up, I believe, being, was it 5th? I don't have the list in front of me for some reason. But that pick not being in the top 2 is beneficial for Ottawa. And they did end up going out and getting a first-round pick in from the Columbus Blue Jackets at 19th overall. This team is a team that is in complete rebuild mode, whether their owner wants to fully admit it or not. So this squad here, Mark, what would you be saying they would need to go after to add to their prospect cupboards? And, this team being a rebuild team, they're probably going to try to get someone who can play in the lineup in the next 1 to 2 years to add a little bit more sizzle to what they already have cooking with Tkachuk and everything else.
Well, I'm going to go sort of against the grain on this one, guys. And I think the guy that could possibly be somebody that they really look at that spot is Spencer Knight. I'm not sold on Philip Gustafson as a goal of the future for the Senators. I think they've got obviously some high-end guys on the back end going to get Brandstrom and Shabbat. Having those guys on the back end up front, they've got Tkachuk and some good young forwards coming up. Logan Brown and those guys. You know what? Spencer Knight's the best goaltending prospect I've seen in 4 or 5 or 6 years in the draft. 19 to me is rich for a goalie, but this kid has a chance to be a special goaltender. And I'm not sure he's still going to be there. I'm thinking he probably is. And if I'm Ottawa, I might go that route. And there's your goalie of the future. You've got some of the other pieces. Now, as you just said, they might want someone a little sooner to be able to make an impact for them. And he's probably a couple of years away at least as a goaltender. But I think if you're looking to solidify your franchise, if you can get a franchise goalie, and I honestly think Spencer Knight is that might be a guy I might look at.
I feel like the Senators are in a position where they're so bad that they can't go wrong. I feel like getting a first round draft pick goaltender would be a really good use of that draft pick. It's like you got to start somewhere with a rebuild, and Ottawa has they have some young forwards that you don't quite know how good they're going to turn out yet. So if you want to give them support, you go out and you get a good goaltender. And I've always been of the opinion that the earlier you get your goaltender seeing NHL games, the better his career trajectory is going to be. So if they go out and they get a goalie and he's in the NHL within the next 2 years, I'd say that's probably their best. I'm going to agree with you there, Mark. That's probably in their best interest. But I'm going to stick with what I initially said is they really can't go wrong. If they go and decide to get a forward or a defense, I don't see either one of those decisions hurting them. They're in such a poor position standings-wise and development-wise that none of that will hurt them. Only drafting poorly would hurt them. So, if anything, if I was Ottawa, I'd be trying to figure out a way to trade up. Maybe not giving away the pick they have, but adding more, even if it's a second-round pick, because they're going to need it.
No, definitely. Well, building that organization, as we all know, they are going to need to do kind of what the Leafs did and restock the cupboards and keep hitting on players, whether it be in the later rounds or not. The problem I feel within Ottawa, and Mark, you may agree with this, is you have a GM in Pierre Dorion that has his marching orders, and it really comes from Eugene Melnyk, whatever happens to that team. And if he feels there's a player that may, A, sell merchandise, and B, add a little bit of flair to the ice right away, I could see that being the way that Ottawa goes, opposed to the smart route, like you guys are saying, with Spencer Knight, who I did actually have slotted going to the Calgary Flames later on in the episode here. So funny you guys bring him up now. But Eugene Melnyk will have a hand in what goes on with this draft, and I just hope for once maybe he doesn't, and he allows his GM to go out and make the right pick. But we all know that is a tall order, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I think everybody understands and knows that that's the way it runs. And Pierre Dorion is an unbelievably good guy in an unbelievably tough spot, and he's tried to make the best of it. And I know it's been difficult for him. And I think Eugene obviously is hands on, and the more he does it, the worse it gets. I think the one thing about that is when they're picking at 19, you're not going to get a guy in this draft anyways that's going to be a come in and be a star kind of guy. I mean, everybody you take at that spot is going to be 2, 3, 4 years away anyways. Finish their junior career and then go play, in the American League for a couple of years or play in the NCAA for a couple of years. So I think whoever they draft at that spot, they're going to have to wait for anyways. And I think, as I said earlier, I think Spencer Knight's the guy. If I got to wait on a franchise goalie, I'm prepared to do that. But you're right. It's a tough spot with Eugene Melnyk constantly being involved, despite what he says, how he isn't involved. And the other part of it, I really like the DJ Smith hiring. I think DJ is a really good coach, especially for that group. They're gonna struggle. They're young. DJ is very much kind of a young coach and a young mentality. He gets it. He's not a 65-year-old retread coach that's been through the league 6 times. So, I think from that standpoint, they've got a good group going forward. And like I said, if they don't go Knight, they'll get somebody, but it's going to be a few years before that person is able to step in and play for them.
Now, moving out west, we're going to talk about Edmonton next. And do we have to talk? Can we skip Edmonton? Wait, that's right. They have Ken Holland in charge, and they've started firing the non-existent 80s Oilers club. All seriousness aside, this team needs to hit a home run with the 8th overall pick. I think this is where I stop the they need a D narrative and scream, get a guy with speed who is semi-skilled or still developing skill with upside, someone that they can stick with McDavid. So I'm just wondering, is that crazy talk, or what do you guys? James? What do you think the Oilers should be doing in the first round?
Well, for me personally, it's no surprise. You need to get someone who can play with Connor McDavid, whether that you draft a player and really, like Mark said, you don't really know what you're getting in the draft, and you don't know how close or ready a player is going to be for your team. Really, outside of I think the top 2 players and Papu Kako and Mr. Hughes. So you need to find a player that plays with Connor McDavid. I'll go back to that 100 times. One of the league's most deepest commodities is an NHL winger, but you have a cap-strapped Edmonton Oilers squad. So it's either you go into the draft and you draft a player in hopes that he has the speed already and can develop his skills while being with the Edmonton Oilers and playing with Connor McDavid, or again, you go back to like you and Mark were just saying, you grab a player, you develop him, let him finish his junior career, let him go in the AHL and develop him properly. Something that Edmonton has not done with players is develop them properly. And also something they have not done with players is take care of them medically. If you look at Darnell Nurse, if you look at Jesse Puljujarvi with the double hip surgery, there seems to be a lot of botched things going on with young players within the Edmonton Oilers. Now, you do have Ken Holland at the helm, so that may change and he may do different things. Like you just mentioned, we are seeing the jettison of the 80s club from the Oilers with McTavish leaving and numerous different names, Paul Coffey and everything like that. Mark, I'm interested to get your take on what Edmonton will do. This could be the draft that starts to turn the corner finally for the Connor McDavid Edmonton Oilers.
Yeah, I feel like we've said that a few times, haven't we, boys, to be honest with you?
I think we said that last year.
I think we say it every year since Connor's been there. It's an organization that's in disarray, and it has been. I think Ken Holland's going to come in. He's going to try and get some professionalism back into that organization. He's going to be one voice. The hiring of Dave Tippett, I know, wasn't received real well by a lot of those ex-Oilers. But Ken Holland said, I'm in charge, and that's who I'm going to bring in. So I think there's a new dawn in Edmonton. The interesting pick, and you guys talked about having someone that can play with McDavid. I mean, the two guys that jump to mind are the two best goal scorers in the draft. I think Cole Caulfield, there's a whole lot of similarity with Alex DeBrincat. And, of course, the McDavid, DeBrincat success they had in Erie. So it's appealing in one point to say, geez, maybe he comes in and becomes that finisher for McDavid, that he's lacked really since he's been there. And the other guy, of course, is Arthur Kaliev, who's played for Hamilton this year with the Bulldogs and put up 51 in the Ontario Hockey League. I mean, they're two guys that can ride shotgun with Connor McDavid and I think score a lot of goals. Now, at 8, that might be a little rich for me for both those guys. So the potential maybe to move down. But, the old adage in the draft is if there's a guy you like at that spot, if you really, really like him, you think he fills a spot, then take him. So, maybe they take one of those guys there and think they finally got a trigger man for Connor McDavid. But, when I was going through it and trying to go through each team's needs, the thing that kept coming back to me was best player available. That's an organization that needs to upgrade all over the place. They've got decent prospects, they've got decent young guys, but they don't have a lot of stars on that team. The big German and Draisaitl and McDavid are kind of the two that jump to mind. But, even Darnell Nurse is a good player, but I don't think he's a superstar. So they've got a bunch of good players. They need to get some high-end players. And, whether it be one of those two kids I talked about that's a finisher, maybe it's one of the centermen, they convert to the wing potentially. But, I think if you're going to go forward, I think you're going to go with someone that's going to finish on Connor McDavid's wing, and that's, to me, is going to be Caulfield or Kaliev.
See, and the thing is with the Edmonton Oilers, they have the ability, like the Maple Leafs do with their three-headed monster, to do the same thing. You can run McDavid, Draisaitl, and Nugent-Hopkins down the middle, but you need wingers to play with them, and that seems to be the problem. And if they go the route you're talking about, maybe starting to fill McDavid's wing with a young, talented, goal scorer, could help the prospect of moving Draisaitl down and then slotting Nuge in the third, and then you start to have a team that is harder to play against when you have 3 lines that you can possibly roll.
Yep, I think that's a great point, and I think that's going to enter into their thinking. I think Keith Gretzky's going to have a big part of this draft. So Keith's got a pretty good track record as a scout. So we'll see what they do, but I won't shock me if they move down and take one of those scorers.
Before we move on from Edmonton, I'd be interested in getting your perspective on the chances of some sort of blockbuster trade potentially involving the draft picks with the Toronto Maple Leafs. There's so much talk that I've heard about people thinking that there's going to be some sort of blockbuster deal between Toronto and Edmonton. I was just wondering what your perspective on the possibility of that happening is. Is that something we should be looking to see happen, or is it less likely?
Yeah, I'm not sure I see that coming. I mean, again, you never know when Dubas and Holland get together whether they can come up with something. I think if you're the Leafs, they got to figure out their cap problems right now. Any talk of a big trade is going to involve a big guy going away. On Twitter earlier tonight, I talked about the potential of Marner. If you're New Jersey or the Rangers, you talk about trading that pick for Marner. I don't know if Edmonton's in a position to go and do that because I don't think they have the assets to come back. If you're looking at a Nylander to going out there, what are you going to get back from Edmonton? Darnell Nurse, there's a tie in there with Dubas, but I'm not sure that's enough. So, we'll see. I mean, it's anytime two teams like that both have issues they have to solve. I mean, the Leafs have to solve cap problems. Edmonton has to get some good players in. There's certainly potential for a deal, but there's nothing right now that jumps to my mind that would make great sense or perfect sense in that sense at all.
The only player I can see going to the Edmonton Oilers that makes a lot of sense is the connection between Connor McDavid and Connor Brown. And that may be a smaller contract off the Leafs books and also wouldn't take a whole lot of effort to send something back from Edmonton because they would still have enough cap room to take on, I do believe, most of Connor Brown's salary. So, I mean, it may be a dump towards Toronto if they're able to free up more space. But that is one player that I can see, going that way and has already had success with McDavid and knows the ins and out of Connor.
Real good point. I hadn't thought of that, to be honest with you. And I think Connor Brown will be with another team come September when training camp starts. I don't believe Connor Brown will be with the Leafs. So, if you're looking at one of the places that fits, certainly you're right. Edmonton fits Connor, in fact, are very good friends. They played together, obviously, and had great success. So that does make some sense. Coming back the other way, it may be a draft pick coming back, from Edmonton. So, if you're Edmonton, you're upgrading a little bit in your skill side, and you're giving up a pick somewhere down the road. And Kyle Dubas loves to acquire picks, so that does make some sense. But we'll see as it goes before in the next couple of weeks if something happens prior to the draft.
For sure.
Well, speaking of acquiring picks or a lack thereof, we'll talk about Winnipeg next. They don't have a first-round pick. Possibly losing two top defensemen. Would this be a time for the Jets to look at using assets to bring in a guy via trade, like their second-round pick at 51, or do they use that pick to try and draft a defender, stockpile the cupboards, and ease the loss of players like this down the line? Personally, I think that the defense is where they need to fill out that's like Winnipeg's most desperate position that needs to be filled is they need someone to complement Bufflin. But yeah, Mark, what do you think about Winnipeg?
I agree entirely with you. The only thing I will say is about a trade. Those guys love the draft. They drafted very well. They love to have picks. I know it's tearing them apart not to have a first this year. So I'm not sure if they obviously if something came along that would make sense for them to give up that second-round pick, but they really do. They do a great job. Kevin Cheveldayoff and his staff, all those guys do a great job scouting and have for a while now. So I'm not sure with that. I do agree entirely they have to get a defenseman. And again, you're always going best player available when you're picking it. I think it's 51 they pick at. If you're looking at that point, you're going to look at a defenseman, probably the best defenseman on the board because, the gap between their prospects up front and on the back end are pretty significant. So, I think a defenseman probably fits there. Who it is, who knows who falls, but it's I've got pretty good faith in Winnipeg staff that they'll find somebody there in that second round will prove to be pretty good value.
With Trouba rumored to be on the block, do you see, with Winnipeg's, as you said, track record with scouting and wanting to draft and acquiring picks, maybe the thing to do here, do you see them packaging Trouba off to get a bundle of picks, maybe not just a first, but maybe doing it smart like Dubas does with maybe like a second or a third, combined to add some more picks to stockpile the D cupboards? Or do you think they trade Trouba for a first and go looking for one of those other defensemen you're talking about? Because obviously defensemen are a hot commodity, but with Trouba, he is, he's a player that a lot of teams want to add sometimes.
Yeah, I think that, I think certainly that's it. The Winnipeg's window is open now, and it's slowly closing as we go forward. They're not the youngest team in the world. They're not terribly old, but I mean, that window's only open so long. So, if you're going to move a Trouba, then, theoretically you'd like to get something back. But your first point about acquiring numerous picks, I mean, I know Winnipeg staff pretty well, and they're as confident as any team in the league in terms of their ability. So, they could very easily talk Cheveldayoff into getting some extra picks and assuring them that they can start to build not only the back end, but the whole prospect cover that they've got going forward. So, I think ideally they could keep Trouba, but if they do trade him, I think the possibility exists of doing a kind of a multiple pick deal where they get a number of picks and they can try to restock the cupboards.
Well, the other thing that's been rumbling around the rumor mill lately is Patrick Laine. Obviously didn't have a extremely consistent productive year, still scored over 30 goals, but the production, the stops and the starts were a little bit scary for most teams, and I'm sure for Winnipeg as well. There's a little bit of a rumor that he may not want to stay in Winnipeg. Do you see them wanting to get rid of a player like that? Obviously not, from my perspective, but I'm wondering what you would think with a player like Patrick Laine. If he does indeed want out, do you try to convince him to stay, or again, do you go and stockpile assets?
Well, when I watch Patrick Laine play, he can be incredibly maddening to watch. I mean, in terms of he can dominate a game, and as an evaluator, you're looking at a kid that's got all the tools, but seldom seems most excited about scoring goals and scoring goals only. So, I could understand if Paul Maurice and those guys are getting a little bit tired of it now. You never want to give up a guy that can score at that rate. I mean, he's got 30, and he's only going to get more. He goes on, gets bigger, stronger, and starts to figure the league out more and more. But no, I think there's a temptation to want to move him, but I think at the end of the day, they figure out a way to make it work because those guys come along very, very seldom. They can put the puck in the net the way they can. Again, with their window being open now, if you trade them for some younger assets, okay, now all of a sudden Scheifele's getting older. The rest of those guys are getting older. So at the end of the day, I think they try to find a way. Now, I think he's an RFA, so we'll have to see what happens with that. Maybe a team offer sheets him. Who knows how it goes? But, one way or another, I think they got to try to find a way to keep him there because as maddening as he can be, he wouldn't be the first player we've seen who, started his career with bad habits and turned into ultimately, a really good player. I mean, look at Ovechkin, how Ovechkin started his career. And, obviously he's turned into what he's become now. So I think the temptation might be to look and try to acquire a bunch of assets, but I think at the end of the day, you've got a pretty good player in your stead right there that gets the system, and you try to keep him unless he demands a trade, which, who knows what happens with that part.
No, for sure. Well, moving on from Winnipeg, we'll jump over to Calgary next. And Calgary has the 26th overall pick. But the problem with the Calgary Flames is they are a great team that lacks consistent, awesome goaltending. And we know that in the playoffs and during the regular season, goaltending can be your undoing completely. This team needs to get solidified in that spot. They may be able to roll with what they have for maybe a season, 2, possibly 3, but they need something coming down the line. And I talked to you guys about this a little earlier, where I said I had the Calgary Flames going after Spencer Knight. He may not be available at that point, but I do see Calgary needing to go out and probably grab the best goaltending asset in this draft, which is Spencer Knight. But being at the 26th overall pick, and if he's not available, do you pull what a lot of GMs do? Do you canvas the floor and say, hey, do you have somebody you want at 26? Okay, we'll flip them for a second, or a combination of picks like some GMs do. Mark, what do you see the goalie-starved Calgary Flames doing?
Well, I'm not as down on their goalie crop as you are. I don't think. Now again, do they have a guy that they think can take them to Stanley Cup? I'm a big fan of Tyler Parsons. And I think John Gillies has something to offer them as they go forward in terms of those are two guys they can look at. Now, Spencer Knight's sitting there at 26, and you got a chance to get him, and you believe he's a franchise guy. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be 6 or 7 or 8 teams ahead of them that are thinking the same thing. So, if he happened to be sitting there and that's the option they had, I think they could go that way. Again, I think they're a team that at that point in time, you never know who's going to fall. I mean, having done this for so long and worked in the National League, what will happen is they may pick 26, but on their own list, there'll be a guy sitting there that they have at 11 or 12. So when you get into that spot, you jump all over it and you're excited because, you've gotten a guy that you had 11th overall and you're getting him at 26. Now, again, who that is, they've got a staff that's all over the place. They spend a lot of time. Todd Button is one of the respected head scouts in the league. So, who that guy is, nobody can tell at this point in time. You never know who's going to fall. But, I could see them, if Spencer Knight's there, doing it. But again, I think they'll go best player available no matter what position just because they've got pretty decent depth all through the organization.
I think that if they were really desperate for a goaltender, that they would be better off using this draft pick as a trade to try and trade for a goalie that's already proven himself to be in the NHL. Even if Spencer Knight does turn out to be a franchise player, he's not going to be that for another few seasons, and Calgary need a goalie before that. So I don't think it really makes sense for them to draft I don't even think if Spencer Knight is maybe they'll take Spencer just because he's so good, and if he's available at that point, you trade him so you can get assets. But I don't think they need him right now. They need a guy who already is playing, top level NHL goalie. Yeah.
All right, so you guys both said that I'm kind of wrong on the goaltending, but what do you guys think that they desperately need, though? Like I said, this team is already looking awesome up front. They have one of the best D-cores in the NHL. So what do you think this team needs to get them over the hump? Or even as a player that they can add in maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years that will be that player to push them forward, or even be on the third line to be a Tom Wilson-esque kind of guy?
Well, we talked earlier about the potential of the window closing, and not that their window is necessarily closing, but when you're close as they were and had a season like they had, the temptation of 26 is to look and get somebody from another team. You know, if there's somebody that is sitting there that a team's looking to move, you know, there's going to be a number of those guys at the draft, and if Calgary sits and decides that he can help them, I could see that. Other than that, I mean, they just need to, the old adage, get the best player available. But I mean, because they don't have any glaring need, in my opinion, I think they just figure out who the top guy on their list is, and I don't know I don't know who that's going to be at that point in time, but you know, I think they're built for success right now. Mike Smith, you know, certainly has an up and down year for them, and that is an issue they have. Maybe they trade 26, as you guys talked about, you know, maybe for a more proven starting goalie then Spencer Knight will be right away. But I don't know if you can really forecast what they're going to do, because at that point in the draft, there'll be be some surprise guys still sitting there that they wouldn't have thought were there.
Well, we'll shift gears to the last team before the Toronto Maple Leafs, and that is the Vancouver Canucks, who seem to be on an upswing. You look at the exciting young players that are starting to show flair there in Vancouver. They need to keep the vibe going. The last two 10th overall picks the Vancouver Canucks had were one Cody Hodgson and the late Luc Bourdon. Both players were seen to be players with huge promise, and so you're looking for Vancouver to add someone again with that kind of same notion of huge promise, can do us well. They've gone D heavy last year. If you look at their draft record for last draft. So to me, it'd be only natural probably for this team to look to move towards picking a forward this time with their first round pick. And I'm wondering, Mark, what guy at 10th overall would be a player you could add to the likes of Pettersson and Besser and Horvat?
Well, let me give you my spiel first. When I was doing my draft prep, one of the things is, as much as they've drafted defensemen, they seem to have had a love affair with left shot defensemen. They really do lack any kind of right shot defenseman, and I know, coming from the Toronto market, certainly we haven't heard that once or twice already in that market, but that's something that they really are lacking is a guy, or some guys that you really think can be big time players. So I mean, the two right shot defensemen that are going to be there at 10, I think that could help them, and they may be very interested in taking would be Victor Soderstrom, Swede, or Mark Seidel, the big German. I think either one of those guys, a big right shot D. Soderstrom's not big, but he's a very skilled guy. Seider's a big, strong. We saw him at the World Championships, and he was very, very good for Germany. So I think that's one possibility. Now you talk, your point being that they might want to go up front. I think you're going to end up with one of those Western Hockey League centermen there. Could they end up with Peyton Krebs or Dylan Cousins potentially? I think there's a chance certain guys are going to fall. All the Americans are going to go early. So, one of those guys makes sense. But I really think it won't shock me if when we leave the draft in Vancouver, I think that one of those right shot D or somebody that they look at, because we know how valuable they are in the league, and you've got a chance at one of those two guys, which are real good players. So those are two guys I'd kind of circle and keep an eye on as far as Vancouver goes.
All right. So D going for Vancouver. Doug, what were you going to jump in there with?
I was going to say that it just seems like whenever I read anything about the Vancouver Canucks and their draft picks, I just see the same name, Podkolzin, coming up again and again and again. I know nothing about the guy, so I was going to ask what Mark knows about him and if he slots in good with Vancouver.
Well, Podkolzin's got top 5 talent really in the draft. He's got a lot. Very, very skilled kid that can do a lot of things, can really play. My problem is I've seen him play when he's been really good, and I've seen him play when he's been invisible or worse than invisible. And that always concerns me. If I'm picking in the top 10, do you want to try to hit home run? Sure, but the potential exists. The other problem he has, he's got 2 years left in the KHL on a contract. He's going to fulfill those 2 years, and you don't know what happens. As I always say, and if I'm a Russian, do you want to be riding the buses in, the American League on a Thursday night, or do you want to be playing in your homeland, making 1.9 or 3.2 a year in Russia? So it's a risky pick, and I just somebody's obviously going to take him. Just the talent alone, you can't pass on him too long. But he's a guy that can get somebody fired, and it's what we say in the business with a guy like that. That if he never comes over and you waste a top 10 pick or a top 12 pick on him, that might be the end of your job, because your GM's going to have some pretty serious questions about why you went that way. So he, whether he goes to Vancouver, they've got some offensive depth in the prospect system, and can they take a chance? Sure, but no team really wants to take too many chances when you're picking 10th overall. So does he fit with their skill set if he comes over and played with Pettersson? I mean, that might be an unbelievable pairing for sure, but at the same time, I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't be taking him there at that with some of the risks associated with him.
I mean, you got me convinced. I wouldn't take him.
Well, now to move on to the elephant in the room. Obviously, this is a Leaf-centric podcast. So, yes, we saved the best team for last, in my opinion, which is the Toronto Maple Leafs. Mark, we have a bevy of things to talk about before we talk draft-specific about the Leafs. Just a few things I want to ask your opinion on that are circulating with the Maple Leafs. And, Doug, you have a few things you want to ask as well. So, we'll get firing right away on this one. Kyle Dubas came out and said they do not yet have a first-round pick. And with many rumors swirling around the Toronto Maple Leafs, I'm wondering how they may be able to get one first-round pick or multiple first-round picks, depending on what happens with Mitch Marner. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the Maple Leafs getting into the first round.
Well, I think if they're going to get in the first round, they're going to get high in the first round. They're not going to trade up and get the 22nd pick. I just don't see that. They again, they feel like they're real close now. They've got some pieces they've got to fill. And of course, as we all know, they've got the cap issue, and they've got some players that not everybody fits. So, you look at a guy like Nazem Kadri and talk to a team, and maybe throw something else in to try and get a top 10 pick thrown in there. We talk about Edmonton. Is that maybe a spot where Edmonton says, listen, we go Nazem Kadri and Connor Brown, maybe for the 8th pick. Again, I'm spitballing here, but if they're going to get into that first round, I expect them to get high into the first round. The draft it's a good draft, but they don't need any more third and fourth line guys. They need some guys that they can get under a rookie contract that can come in and be an impactful guy. So I think if they do, I don't know if it'll happen. But if they do, I expect they'll get into that top 10 as opposed to being into the sort of 11 to 30 picks.
So then, let's say they do get that draft pick. Do you see them hanging on to whoever they get with it, or do you see them either moving that pick that they get to someone else for something, or eventually moving the player they draft? Like, is that a pick that they're getting to develop the team, or is it a pick that they're getting to facilitate some other move?
Well, I think if they jump into the top 10, there's somebody they've got their eye on and that they feel like they're going to get. That very well may happen, in a timeout on draft night, potentially. Somebody falls a couple spots to them and a team is willing to look at, they've done some preliminary talk, and if the guy's there, maybe it happens. But no, I think if they jump into that top 10, they're going to draft a guy, and that's a guy they feel like can come in and be an impact guy, in 2 years, 3 years at the most. So, I think that's the way they go. Ultimately, I don't ultimately think they do get into the first round. But if they do, it'll be a guy that they'll draft, they've targeted, and feel real strongly that he can come in and be a star.
Well, the question that I have basically with the Maple Leafs and why I said, do they look for multiple draft picks? With Mitch Marner, obviously, there's the fear of the dreaded offer sheet that is out there. And it makes it seem like the Maple Leafs are the only team that have RFAs available for teams to try to poach. But if you are, Mark, and put your GM cap on a second here, Kyle Dubas walks up to you and says, Mark, what do we do here? Team has offer sheeted Mitch Marner for 10.5 plus. Do we match or do we let him walk and recoup the 4 first-round picks? What do you do in that instance?
No, I think you have to match. I think Mitch Marner's one of the top 15 players in the league right now, and is only getting better. There's nothing this kid has done that makes you think, geez, there's an issue in his game. So I think you have to match. They have to match almost at any number. Unfortunately, that's the spot they're in. And knowing Darren Ferris, he's going to get every dollar he can for his client. He's an unbelievable agent that fights as hard as any agent does for their client. So he's going to want to get every penny he can. But I think if a team comes in at 10-5, you've got to match that offer. And at that point, now you've got some roster issues, and you're going to have to reconstruct your roster and move some guys out for sure. I expect this summer that, I think there'll be 6 or 7 or 8 new faces on the Leafs by the time the season starts. I think there has to be some change to that roster just because of the cap that it's going to end up with. And if they get Marner in at, say, 10.5, just for argument's sake, now you've got some big numbers under that you're going to have to move. Obviously, we've heard of the Marlowe deal, as I said, but those numbers aren't going to solve the problems. You're going to have to move somebody bigger out, whether it be Nylander or whether it be Kadri. something like that. But to answer your question, I think you have to match that number. You can't let them go for 4 potential first-round picks, and you never know what that's going to be. Now when they're going to be able to make an impact, and that 4th pick is 4 years down the road. So you're looking at 7 years from now, he's going to be part of the team. So I think you have to match it and then try to figure out the problems from there.
Definitely.
Yep, I've said many times that Marner is only improving, and when you're a 90 plus point getter and you're improving, I think any team would be making a massive mistake not to do whatever they can to sign that guy. So I 100% agree with you, Mark. For a second, it sounded like I was listening to myself, because I swear to God, I've said exactly what you said about 100 times. I think he's a top 15, a top 20 forward in the league right now, and I think he's probably going to be top 5, top 3 within the next 5 years, and then you'll be thinking 10.5 is a deal. So definitely on the same page there.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, and not to derail things here, I know we're talking about the draft, but I was doing some draft prep, and let me ask you guys, are knowledgeable as anybody around. If all of a sudden you're Ray Shero, and you think about trading for Mitch Marner and give up Jack Hughes. Now, it might sound crazy, you're giving up Jack Hughes, but I mean, at the end of the day, if Jack Hughes becomes as good as Mitch Marner, you'd be pretty happy, I would think, wouldn't you? I gotta believe that's one of the ceilings. And if you're Kyle Dubas, do you take Jack Hughes? Now you've solved your cap problems because you got Jack Hughes on a rookie deal. So, or if you're the Rangers, Capo Caco, it's an interesting concept, because I think the Leafs are going to have trouble. 10.5 might be cheap for what Darren Ferris and his group is going to want for Mitch Marner and the family. So, it solves a problem from the Leafs. And if you're the Rangers or the Devils, you've now got your centerpiece you can build around, fan favorite. He's going to be a star. He's already a star, so he's not going to digress. So, what are your thoughts? I was thinking about it.
I don't like how much sense that makes. I like Mitch Marner, man. I don't want to get rid of him, but honestly, that makes almost too much sense. That if that's what you have in front of you, and you're Kyle Dubas, that he has to do something to. We had an episode a few weeks ago called the Summer of Dubas, and that's the type of move that Dubas has. That's exactly the type of move that Dubas has to make in order to remain the Leafs GM beyond next season or the season after. Is that level of wizardry? I never would have thought of that. That's genius. What do you think, James?
The only issue I have with it is, yes, Hughes and Kako look the part. They look like they're going to be great players. Mitch Marner is a great player right now. And you went out and signed John Tavares. You extended William Nylander. You extended Austin Matthews. You have Morgan Rielly and Nazem Kadri. The list goes on. You built this team because you thought your window is now. We talk about players being sometimes, magic beans. You never know what you're going to get until they fully develop and get going. Mitch Marner hit 93 points this season. Obviously has a steady trajectory going up. But do these players gel with the players on the Maple Leafs? Do they fit in? Are they looking to be the lead piece or a complementary piece? Players like Phil Kessel, we tried to force him into being the star in Toronto, and we know how that worked out. He went to Pittsburgh, great complementary player, not the player. Some of these guys going first and second overall may have the mentality that they want to be the player on a new team. It always looks back, and you look at the dressing room and everything that goes on. You jet send Mitch Marner out for one of these players. How does that affect the locker room, especially with how close this team perceivably has become, with Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, William Nylander, all the guys, the younger group, they seem to be, close-knit. And I know hockey is a business and it's a harsh business, but I would think long and hard before moving Mitch Marner for what could be a proven commodity, but isn't just yet in the NHL.
Well, let me play devil's advocate just to continue. I don't want to hijack the podcast, but I think it's certainly that would be the issue that I think if you're Jersey or the Rangers, you're thinking about. We've got a proven star in Mitch Marner here as opposed to what could happen. So I think that might be the attraction for them. And if you're Dubas and the Leafs, now all of a sudden you've got that $10.5 million you were going to spend on him. Now you keep the rest of the guys you want to keep. Now you've got some extra cap room to go get somebody else. Plus you're going to have Jack Hughes or Capo Caco who. Again, we don't know if they're going to be superstars. I said to somebody today when I asked them, we thought the same thing about Patrick Stefan, and and Nail Yakupov, we swore they were going to be superstars, and that can't miss. And we saw how that worked out. So there's always a risk to it for sure. But I just think it's interesting. I think it'd be something that'd be interesting for those guys, to at least think about. And whether it happens, obviously, it's pretty doubtful. But I think you could make a case for both sides as to why it might be something that they might consider.
Well, you go out and you make that trade, and then you sign Artemi Panarin, and then you look like a huge genius because then you have both those players. I get that side of it. It's just for me, I would hope that one of those players, if you did that deal, turns out to be almost as good as Mitch Marner, because obviously we see that he is the stick that serves the drink on the power play, and just his vision and craftiness, it is just next level. So, you know what? I agree with you in the fact that you would save that money, you could spend it somewhere else, get the D you're looking for, maybe get another nice winger or whatever to add to the mix. And yeah, it does solve problems. I mean, you're swaying me.
Mark, do you think Jack Hughes is like as sure of a star player as, say, like Laine or Matthews was? Because like people knew that those guys were going to get in the league and maybe not tear it apart the way they did, but do really well and be successful. Do you think Jack Hughes? I know he's a first-round draft pick. I feel like even 5 or 10 years ago, there wasn't as much scouting support. Like guys just weren't as sure about stuff like this, and so I'm wondering how much of a quote-unquote sure thing do you think Jack Hughes really is?
Well, I think he's a real thing. I think he's got a chance to be Connor McDavid light. He's going to have the same impact on the game that Connor McDavid has. Well, as a sort of Connor McDavid light. So, he's not Connor McDavid, obviously, but I think that same kind of impact, the speed he plays with, the vision, the IQ he plays with is unbelievable. And I think he's going to be able to create that in the NHL. Now, his size, always concerns you when he's a little smaller, the wear and tear. So I think there's that concern. But, I mean, the way the game is going, I don't see any doubt in my mind. I didn't doubt Mitch Marner was going to be a star. Not that it makes me any smarter than anybody else, because if you watched him that year in London, you knew what a player he was going to become. And I feel sort of the same about Jack Hughes. There's a few things everybody talks about Marner's size, and the same thing with Hughes. And the same with Kakko. I mean, Kakko to me is a star. He's a big, strong kid. Plays way different than Jack Hughes, obviously. But I think both those guys. If I could draft those guys, I could feel pretty. I would be positive that they're going to be stars in the league. So again, have I been wrong? Absolutely. Did I have Nail Yakupov first overall? Yeah. So it certainly doesn't make me any smarter than anybody else. But yeah, to answer your question, now if you're picking the 3, would you do it if you're 3? No, I'm not as sure. Bowen Byram is going to be a good defenseman. I think I really like him, but could I see him becoming a 3 or 4 in the league? Sure, and that's not as sure. So the gap after 1 and 2 goes by pretty quick. So anywhere past those 2, I wouldn't be doing anything close to it. But with those 2 guys, I feel pretty rest assured they're going to be really, really good players in the National League.
Well, now to jump into this year's draft with the Maple Leafs and what they have right now. Toronto is slated to draft 53rd overall in the second round, and after taking 8 defensemen over the past 2 drafts and 2 goalies as well, the focus probably still will be on D, right-handed D specifically, because obviously, as the adage goes, you can never have enough cheap D around, experienced D, and if you're developing them within the system, it's good to have them for deep playoff runs. We've seen teams go through them. Look at Pittsburgh a couple of years ago. But the other thing that I'm thinking about is the league is starting to have a taste or maybe a thirst for players like Tom Wilson, Ferland, Marchand for a lesser extent, that are physical, can grind it out, but make you pay on the scoreboard as well. Do you see the Leafs maybe searching for someone like that and adding that to their cupboard, or are they just going to covet another smooth skating, right-handed, puck-moving defenseman?
Well, I think you have to understand Kyle Dubas, and you guys obviously, you know exactly what kind of team he's trying to build. He believes that the game should be played a certain way, and I think that's obvious how they're doing. I can guarantee you one thing: whoever they take at 53, if they end up taking that pick, that guy will be able to skate, and that guy will be highly skilled. Those are 2 things I can guarantee you as I sit here right now, because that is how Kyle thinks the game should be played, and he thinks that's how he wants to build his team. And down the road, we'll see if that's correct or not. But he's adamant about it. He's as sure of that as much as he is the sun's going to come up tomorrow. So, I don't think those kind of guys are hard to find. Those Tommy Wilsons, you see in these playoffs, certainly, they can be hugely impactful. But at 53, you're not going to get a guy that's that kind of a player. So, I think they're going to go after somebody. I mean, a couple names, preparing for tonight. A couple names. An interesting name for me is Kirill Slepov, who may not seem familiar to too many people. At the World Juniors, he was unbelievable for Russia, and he's a 99, so he's a lot closer to playing. Tremendous foot speed, can really skate, really dominate the World Juniors with his offense. He's a guy that's kind of off the radar at 53. That's the kind of guy that, Dubas, I could see Dubas reach out and grab it. Bobby Brink is a guy, USHL star, plays the under-18s for Team USA. Came in and played for him. I'm not sure he's still going to be there, but again, skill and skate. Those are two things they're going to do. Right shot defensemen, as much as I say there's not many defensemen in this draft, there's even less right shot defensemen. They're like unicorns, these guys. You can't find them anywhere. They exist, but you don't see them very often. So, at that spot in time, at 53, I think in Kyle Dubas' form, he'll sit and look if there's a guy there that he feels he likes and fits what they need. And if not, he'll trade down and try to get somebody and add some picks for later on.
If there's any NHL teams looking for a right-handed defenseman, I used to play single A for the Vaughan Panthers, and I was a right-handed defenseman. It's my dad. Okay, so there's a reason I said that. It's because my dad told me when I was a kid, and I must have been like 5 or 6 when I asked him this question, what position gives me the best chance of making the NHL? And he told me right-handed defenseman. It's a position that is always in constant demand. It's kind of ridiculous that you're talking like 20 years of a drought of right-handed D. You'd think that some kid's coach somewhere would figure that out and start trying to develop more of them from a younger age. I don't know what it is about that position that just seems to be impossible to find kids that make it all the way through junior hockey, but it's been a trend for so long, and I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it is. It's certainly an outlier. You're right. I mean, obviously there's more left-hand shots than right-hand shots, so statistically, there's going to be a higher number of left-hand defensemen. But you're right. The inordinate amount of left-shot defensemen that are playing a league, and how few right-shot defensemen, impactful right-shot defensemen are. It is a bit of an anomaly, and I don't think there's any rhyme or reason. I think your dad was way smarter, way ahead of his time, because I don't think anybody else would have thought that back then. But he's exactly right. I mean, those guys, there's a premium on them. I mean, obviously we've seen the premium that, Mike Babcock would like to pay for those guys and how strongly he feels about it. So, but yeah, it's just, they're tough to find. And if you get one, you want to hang on to them. And that's why nobody wants to trade them either. So they're hard to find. But, I know Kyle and that staff will be searching all over trying to find somebody to try and step into a couple of those spots and hopefully even that defense core a little bit.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm very excited to find out what every team that we've talked about tonight does during the draft, see where we've hit, where you hit, and I'd love to get you back on maybe just after free agency and everything and the craziness dies down in July, and just talk about where everything fell and see what the teams are going to do from there.
Absolutely, boys. I'm always happy to come on. I always enjoy it. It's a good time, and anything you need, anytime you want me on, by all means, let me know, and I'm happy to come on and try to get that point in time.
Well, we super appreciate you always being available to us, Mark, and good luck with the draft and all the prep, and I'm sure we'll be pinging more questions off you as it comes closer.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.